Greetings, viewers, and welcome to our Sage 200 Data Dictionary webinar. Today's presentation will cover the following: an introduction, the data dictionary, primary keys and foreign keys, and the data dictionary views. Now, the data dictionary is really a very useful application within Sage 200 Evolution. And as the name implies, it really is a dictionary consisting of all the SQL tables which can be found in a standard evolution database, together with details about the columns that form part of the table, as well as the various characteristics within that table. Let's see exactly how this works. So the data dictionary can be found on the Evolution install disk under a folder called Data Dictionary. And when opening up that folder called Data Dictionary, you'll find a file called evdict.exe. This is the exe file used to run the Evolution Data Dictionary. So in running the the evdict.exe file, you're going to see a landing page. Now, on the left-hand side, you need to insert details of your SQL server name, together with your common database name. On the right-hand side, details of your SQL server name, together with a transactional database, being a database where transactions are being processed. And then use the connect button to connect to the data dictionary. Once the connection has been established, you'll find the data dictionary, and you'll notice is that we have a whole list of tables on the left-hand side. These are all the standard SQL tables which can be found in the Evolution database. So start with the _BTBL range of tables, followed by the _ETBL, the RET tables, these being tables related to the retail point of sale module, then the _RTBL being the resolve or content management tables, and then a whole range of tables relating to things like master files, etc. Right. And then lower down, we also have a whole range of views. These are views which can be found within the Evolution database, and you would need to be familiar with these views and these tables in order to run SQL scripts in a database, and also use this information if you're intending to, for example, integrate a third-party application via the SDK into Evolution database. So let's take a look at the tables, and I'm going to start off with the client table. So the client table really is a table where it stores all the customer information. When creating a new customer in Evolution, you're going to obviously add relevant information about the customer, and all those details are then stored in the client table. So I'm going to highlight the client table. As you can see, I've got details or information about the table. So there's the name that you'd find within an SQL database. It's also known as the customer table. It tells you that it consists of accounts receivable customer information. If I expand the client table, it's going to give me details about all the columns that are contained within the client table, holding the relevant information. And what you'll notice is that we've got a column with a yellow key indicator. A yellow key indicator signifies that this is a primary key or primary column within the table. And primary keys need to be unique. So if I expand my primary key, or I select it, you'll see that it tells me that it's a primary key. The field is called a DC link, also known as the customer ID. And then just taking a step further, you'll see that there's also a few columns that have a red key indicator. And these indicate that this is a foreign key within the table. Let's just go back one. And if I go to my DC link, which I know is a primary key, it tells me that, once again, I've got an alias being the customer ID. If I open up my Evolution database and I go to maintenance and the customers module, and I go to customers, you'll notice is that we've got a column that we can add, which is the customer ID. So this really is the primary key within the table. And as you can see, as a customer record is being added to the client or to the database, it allocates it a unique customer ID. So there we have the link customer ID, and then we've got the link or the alias, in fact, which is the client table. So very importantly, yellow key indicator means it's the primary key within the table. Right, let's just take it a step further. And as I mentioned, you've got the red key indicators, and those are the foreign keys within the table. So in this instance, we're going to look at, for example, the rep ID. In my Evolution database, if I open up a customer and edit the customer, I'm able to link a representative to a customer. So it's a default representative. When creating a customer transaction for this customer, it'll by default populate the representative field with the details contained in this field on the customer account. If I then go and I expand the rep ID, you'll see that it tells me that it's a foreign key. If I highlight that, it's a foreign key, the sales rep, and the field name is being the rep ID. And what you notice is that we've also got the primary key there, which is part of the sales rep table. So it tells me that this field is a foreign key that identifies a record in sales rep by the primary key field being ID sales rep. Right, let's just go and back into our Evolution database, and I'm going to go into the option to go and create sales reps, which is under customers maintenance. So sales representatives. And as you can see, I can add a column which is a sales rep ID. So once again, it's being a primary key in the sales rep table, and it allocates a rep ID number each time a rep ID or a rep is added to the table. Right, let's just go through to our sales rep table. There we go. And it tells us that it forms part of accounts receivable. If I expand that, you'll see that the primary key there is the ID sales rep. Primary key, ID sales rep is the field name, also known as sales rep ID. And if I then go back into Evolution, you'll see it picking up the sales rep ID being the primary key within that table. So as you can see, very importantly, that tables are being interlinked depending on what information is being stored within those tables. If I then go to in my data dictionary, I've also got, for example, the vendor table, which stores information about my suppliers. So every time a supplier record is added, it's going to populate this table, and very similar to the customer table, the client table, I've got my DC link there and a whole range of tables. And you'll see that it's also linked to foreign keys. And for example, if I move down, I've got things, for example, the foreign keys, the ID areas, etc. So for example, if I take areas or areas ID within a database, I'm able to create areas and link them to my customers and suppliers. So my Evolution database, so I'm going to go to areas. I've got my areas there, and as you can see, I've then got my areas ID, which then corresponds to my ID areas within my areas table. Right, so, and another table that is very commonly used or information extracted from is your STK item table. So STK item table, it contains the stock information. So whenever an inventory item is added, it's then going to populate the STK item table. And if I expand that, we can see that the primary key there is stock link. In my evolution database, if I go to inventory, maintenance, and as if I was going to be adding a new inventory item, you'll see that we then have a table or column there called item ID. And if I revert back to my data dictionary, stock link, the alias is known as the inventory ID. So there's a link within my STK item table. And once again, just a range of foreign keys consist in the table and obviously linked to their own primary key tables. Right, so that's really the situation with regards to master file tables, where you're adding master file records, they being stored in one specific table. However, you do have instances whereby, specifically with regards to transactions, whereby information is stored within two separate tables. If you take the example of an invoice, with an invoice you've got the invoice header, which would contain details about the customer, their contact information, etc., together with, for example, the representative, the order number, etc., as well as the total of the transaction. You then have the header or the header table, also beg your pardon, the lines table, which then consists of the lines that make up that particular transaction. If we then go to, for example, the INV num table, which is the table that stores the invoice header, and there we have the INV num table, and as you can see, it's related to inventory documents. This SQL name is INV num, however, it's also known as the invoice table. And in this instance, we see that the primary table is known, or the primary key is known as auto index. So it tells us it's the primary key, and there's my information. In my evolution database, I'm just, for example, going to go to customers and inquire on a particular customer. Under transaction inquiries, I'm going to go select the customer. There we go. And I'm going to view transactions for that customer. And what you notice is there I've added a column on the grid called Auto IDX. So every time a transaction is processed for customers, suppliers, etc., it's going to populate the INV num table, and the primary key being, or the primary column being Auto IDX, together with the relevant information about that particular invoice or that particular transaction. Right, so at this point, we can just go right click, we can do a drill down, and we've got our information there. Right, just try this particular invoice, and I can do a drill down, and then from there go to the source. So there we have, for example, the header section with the customer information together with the representative, invoice number, etc. And then this section over here would obviously form part of the lines of the transaction. So this section over here would be stored in INV num, and this section over here in the lines table, which we'll come to later, which is known as underscore BTBL invoice lines. Right, so I'm going to go back to my data dictionary, and we've got our auto index, and we know that that's the primary key. I'm then going to go to the lines portion, and as I mentioned, that table is known as underscore BTBL invoice lines. There we go. What you notice is that within the data dictionary, for example, just by looking at the table name, you can, for example, get an idea of what information is stored within that particular table. So in the underscore BTBL invoice lines, it tells me inventory invoice lines. Right, there we go. And if I expand that, you see the primary key there is ID invoice lines. And if I expand that, it's got a couple of information regarding the foreign keys within that table. For example, if you've got details about serial numbers, etc., the line ID. And however, I've mentioned previously is that the header and the lines table are interlinked. In this particular instance, the link here is the iInvoice ID. So as you can see in this particular instance, it's a foreign key within the lines table. And if I expand that, it tells me that it's linked to INVNum and the primary key being auto index. So there we go, there's explanation. And as we've seen previously, it's linked to the header table of the invoicing, linked to the column called auto IDX. Now, for example, if I go to they've got my information, and I'm just going to go back one step. If I go to my INVNum table, there's also very useful information that we can obtain about the document that's been processed. So if I go to my INVNum table, you'll see that very importantly, there's columns called, for example, doc type, doc version, and doc state. So if I go to my auto ID index and I go to doc type, you'll see that it tells me that the different indicators for different document types. For example, 0 being an invoice, 1 credit note, 2 GRV, RTS, etc. So as you can see within the table, it would store a doc type value, and based on the doc type value being stored, it will indicate what type of document it is. For example, if I go to my doc state, it'll store those document state values. For example, 1 being an unprocessed transaction, 2 a quote, 3 partially processed, archive, template, etc. And then we've got our doc flag, which tell us that information about it's either being goods received voucher or supply invoice, etc. So as you can see, each table is going to have a whole range of very important information about the particular table and what information is being stored there. So, for example, as I mentioned with regards to transactions, always normally 2 types of table, being the header and the lines, and those are being interlinked. If we take, for example, let's just go look, for example, at maybe if you're doing an inventory count, and for example, that table is going to be called _BTBL INV count. So it tells me inventory got to do with, for example, inventory count or stock take. And if I go to my evolution, and I'm now going to process or view details of my inventory counts. And what you notice is that I'm simply going to go right click, go and customize the grid columns. And there's a column there called ID. I'm just going to add it onto my grid taskbar. And there we go. So there's my ID, which is the primary key or the number of the actual stock count ID. If I revert back to my data dictionary and I expand my inventory count table, you see the primary key is called ID INV count, which once again corresponds to the identification of my particular inventory count. And then we've obviously got details about, for example, those foreign keys, the agent who created the inventory count, etc., and a whole range of other information there which you would make use of in writing scripts, etc. So we've got the _BTBL INV count, and then the link being the _BTBL INV count lines. If I expand that, it tells us it's the details of each inventory item included in the count, and expand that, and the primary key be there being ID INV count lines, and we know the link between the count table and the lines is INV count ID. If I expand that, there we go. It tells us that's _BTBL INV count, and the column indicator being the identifier or the ID number of that particular identifying number for that particular count. Right, so as you can see, it really is very useful to familiarize yourself with the data dictionary. We've got all the tables that you'd find in this normal evolution or standard evolution database with details about the columns and useful explanations about the characteristics of that particular table. We also, in our data dictionary, we have details about the views. So at the bottom, I can expand the views, and it's going to give me details about all the standard database views that you'll find within your evolution database. And details about the views, for example, customers, clients, etc. And relevant columns, etc. Very easy to identify a view within database. It's going to have a V in the prefix. So as you can see, all of these have got V's, signifying that there are views within the database. So just a quick recap. You can find the data dictionary within the Evolution install, open up the data dictionary folder, run the exe called evdict.exe. You're going to have a prompt in order for you to specify your SQL server name, your common database together with a transactional database, being where transactions are being processed. And then once the connection has been made, you'll be able to access the data dictionary, and you've got details of all the tables together with information about the foreign keys and the primary keys within the actual table. For example, with regards to transactions, the links between the header table and the lines table, and other information that you would need in order to run scripts within the SQL database, or else make use of the table names and table structures if you are going to be integrating a third-party application into Evolution by making use of the Evolution SDK application. I do hope this presentation has been useful. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's over and out for me, and goodbye.